Hello everyone, my name's Cliff and welcome back to my channel. This is Cliff's Dark Gems. Today I'm going to be recommending a handful of classic horror novels for all of you. Please take note that no novellas or short stories, so you won't find any Edgar Allan Poe or H.P. Lovecraft in this video. Please stay tuned. Before we begin, let's just talk about what is a classic, and in particular what is a classic horror. Now people have this misconception that it's only about age, and yes, probably you will find most classics in the early 20th century or in the 19th century and earlier, because they're timeless and they've stood the test of time and they're still talked about and they're still relevant. But I could argue that even going up to the 1960s, 1970s, there are plenty of examples of horror classics and classic literature. Other things about classic novels and classic books is that they're often hugely influential in a specific genre or subgenre, and as I said, they're always fresh. They always seem to be spoken about, talked about, and they have cultural relevance. In other words, kind of instantly recognizable, and often spawn movies and miniseries and so on. And people just seem to recognize them immediately. And that is true for every single one of these books that I'm going to recommend. That they have spawned movies and franchises, and they are at the forefront of their subgenres, or they've influenced certain genres in horror. Okay, first off, I want to just give a couple of special mentions. These books, as far as I'm concerned, are most definitely classics, but there's a reason I didn't include them. First of all, we got Thomas Harris' The Silence of the Lambs. And now I would say this is more a classic of psychological suspense and terror, and not so much horror, although perhaps that could be argued. And I was really considering talking about this, in Hannibal Lecter being just about the most terrifying creature in cinema, as a serial killer, as a cannibal, but yeah, I left this one out. Next one is Stephen King, The Shining, and I very simply left Stephen King out of the picture because I've spoken about him way too many times on this channel. I will speak about him again, but not in the context of this video. I consider Salem's Lot, The Shining, probably Carrie, and they're all good examples of classic horror literature. Okay, first up, and this is in no particular order, we have Bram Stoker's Dracula. And I've got a hardcover edition as well, which is quite pretty. Now, this is not the first vampire novel that was ever written. That was Con Miller. But this is definitely the most recognizable and the most famous, and it has spawned so many movies, and it's just instantly recognizable culturally by anyone out there, and it is actually a fantastic novel. So what is it about? Most of you probably heard the story, but very basically it's about Jonathan, who goes off and travels to Transylvania to meet Count Dracula. And what he does there is he is helping the Count to buy a property in London. Soon after that happens, you get an unmanned ship that is wrecked on shore by England, and some strange things start to happen in London. Now, one thing I find very interesting about this novel is that it's written in a very unique style. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, epistolary or something. But it's basically a series of letters, diary entries, journal entries. So it's basically first-person narration. Now what this does is that gets you in the head of, just excuse the barking if you can hear it, it's a dog next door, it's going crazy. Yeah, but it gets you in the head of the characters, and you get to see the world and experience the world in their mind. I think this first person narration with the journal entries and so on is particularly interesting, and I particularly enjoyed the beginning of the novel with Jonathan Harker, and you basically see him travelling into this strange world, into this different country, and the interactions he has with the locals, and then obviously upon meeting Dracula and the castle. And it's just really interesting because it's almost like a sensory experience that you're seeing it through his eyes with his journal entries. And of course this changes throughout the novel. You then get the girls back in London with their diaries and letters, and so basically the whole thing is very cleverly structured. This might turn some people off, but I think you should give it a go. This is a very powerful novel. Some people say it drags a little bit in places, but I find it very, very enjoyable. And if you're a horror fan, you really should read this novel, and that is Dracula, Bram Stoker. Okay everyone, I don't own the next book anymore, but now we're going to talk about Psycho by Robert Bloch. And now this book is loosely based on the real life case of the serial killer Ed Gein. And yeah, if you don't know about the story, it is about this woman who's a secretary. She runs away from her boss, stealing a large amount of money, and she ends up staying overnight at this motel called Bates Motel, which turns out to be a big mistake, because at the Bates Motel, the proprietor, Edmund Bates, don't tell me I've got that wrong, Norman Bates, my apologies. But anyway, he's obsessed with his mother, and he's a very, very sick individual, and things can't go right. Things go pretty wrong from there. Now what's interesting about this is obviously this had a huge influence on the slasher genre and on the kind of psychological horror. But what I found very interesting about this novel as opposed to the movie is that the novel is far more violent and actually far more traumatic. And I think that is as a result of it. At that time, in making a movie, they simply couldn't be as explicit, as perhaps Alfred Hitchcock would have wanted it to be, so they had to tone it down. But as I say, yes, the violence, it's gruesome, so just realize that that is a big difference between the two. Another interesting fact about this particular book is that, or more likely the movie, is that Alfred Hitchcock, when he got rights to the movie, he bought up all the novels, so that, because he wanted the viewers, the audience, not to realize that there was a twist at the end. And in this particular novel there is quite a wicked twist, unexpected and very exciting. So yeah, do yourselves a favor, and that is Psycho by Robert Bloch. Okay, and the third book I'm going to talk about is the classic I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And once again, I don't have a copy, so you'll find it up there. Now this is a post-apocalyptic tale, an absolute classic, about the last man on Earth, and this virus or this bacteria has basically wiped out the planet, and we find this guy months later or years later, I can't remember which, but he's basically alone, and he's basically haunted by the idea of his wife and his child. And what he does is the rest of the population is being turned into these vampires. And so what he does, he spends his days going out and staking the vampires, killing them off. And that's because he can't shoot them. Apparently guns have actually no effect on these creatures. And then in the nights he boards himself up and drinks himself into a stupor. And it's basically a very, very sad look at loneliness and isolation and depression. And it's not graphic, it's not overly violent, but it just does explore these things. It's a study in isolation and what happens to this man. And you know, the lengths he goes to for survival, where he doesn't actually want to survive really because he's the last man left on Earth. But he does try to find a cure. In a very scientific way, he tries to go about finding a way to basically bring these creatures back, but that doesn't happen. One thing that's very, very interesting about this novel, and it's very different to the movie with Will Smith, I Am Legend, is that it's got a very, very unexpected ending. And basically that comes to the title, I Am Legend. Now, if you want to know why that's the title and who speaks those words, it's a good idea to actually read to the end. And it really does a whole flip thing about vampires and human beings. And without giving anything away, it talks about evolving, sort of an evolution sort of thing. So I just found that very, very interesting. Whereas the actual movie, Hollywood gave it a very Hollywood ending. It's a lot more bleak in this particular book. Some interesting facts is that George R. Romero, his Night of the Living Dead, one of my favorite movies, that was inspired by I Am Legend. And I Am Legend, Richard Matheson, was in turn inspired by Dracula. That is I Am Legend. Okay, in fourth position, or the fourth book I'm going to talk about, is what many call probably the most terrifying novel and movie ever made, and that is Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. Now, I'm not sure about the most terrifying novel in the world, but it is very, very compelling. And it tells a story of a young mother who's an actress and actually gets a chance to be a director, and her daughter. And her daughter becomes very ill, and strange things start happening around the house. And they try to get help. The mother tries to get help for the daughter and takes her to the doctor. The doctor says there's nothing wrong. So at first they think there's some kind of rational explanation for the whole thing. But it turns out she's being possessed by a demon. Now this is really the original and the best possession tale. And I'm not really into movies that are all about, demon possession. It's probably one of my least favorite genres. But this novel is different. It's very powerful, it's got very powerful themes, and it's really, really engaging. Where she gets the help of this priest who just happens to be losing his faith, and actually studied psychology. And at first the priest is skeptical and wants to try to come to some other conclusion besides the fact that there's demon possession involved. Now he's joined by another priest eventually, who's got some experience on the matter, but unfortunately has a little bit of a faulty heart condition. And then what happens, really the center of the story is around this possessed child and these two priests that are fighting for her soul. And now willing to give up their lives, and they're basically fighting with this demon. That's a very strong thing about good versus evil. But the best parts in this book for me are the dialogue and this kind of war of wits between these men and this demon. And it gets quite harrowing and gets quite traumatic. And there's a real sense of atmosphere in this book. It's very powerful and actually very, very terrifying. Interesting little fact is that William Peter Blatty was influenced to write this novel based on a real case that I think took place in 1949, I suppose. Yeah, 1949, of a 14-year-old boy that was presumably possessed by a demon. So that's where he got his thing to actually write this book. That is William Peter Blatty, The Exorcist. Now really, this is basically, in fact, all of these books I'm talking about, if you call yourself a horror fan, you really should give them a go. Some of them might seem a bit dated, but it's well worth the effort just to say, I've read that classic. Okay, that's The Exorcist. Okay, finally, going to present a little novel, not a very long novel, but also a lot of people might say this is not horror, more like a fantasy, dark fantasy, but whatever it is a book that is truly a classic, and that is Ray Bradbury, Something Wicked This Way Comes. I have spoken about this little book numerous times on my channel, and Ray Bradbury, and this book in particular, has had a huge impact on Stephen King's writing, Neil Gaiman, as well as R.L. Stein. So it's also been made into a movie. I don't think the movie is particularly good. I'd love to see another remake, Maybe somebody else could do it, but it is a powerful little book about a dark carnival that rolls into a Midwestern town, and these two young boys born either side of midnight, and it's just about their adventures with this carnival that steals your souls. And yeah, it's very powerful. It's got some incredibly beautiful prose. That's one thing about Ray Bradbury. It's so poetic. His prose is just so gorgeous, so lyrical. But yeah, this is, as far as I'm concerned, this is a timeless classic, and it's going to continue to live in people's minds for as long as we live. It's just such a powerful little book. Now, fun fact about Ray Bradbury, that he was inspired to become a writer because he attended a carnival, and one of the performers was named Mr. Electro, and took a sword, because I think he was sitting when he was a boy, he was sitting in one of the front parts of the carnival, put the sword and said, "Live forever." Yeah, that's a true story, and that inspired him to actually become a writer. So that is Something Wicked This Way Comes. Okay everyone, so that's my choice for some recommendations for you for horror classic novels, and what do you think of that? What are your favorite classic horror novels? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoy this show, if you enjoy this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. That'll really help me out. Until next time, take care of yourselves, keep those pages turning, and cheers.